Hello, my name is Minkailu Kanute, or just Min for short, and welcome to the first Talk with Min. In these talks, I'll normally just talk about a subject that has piqued my interest or that I feel as though I can just ramble on about, honestly, for a few minutes. And today, I'm going to be talking about the naming of U.S. military installations after Confederate generals. Now, there are currently 10 U.S. military installations named after Confederate generals. No other nation on earth has bases named after officers or soldiers who fought against them in a war. However, the early 20th century United States government thought it was acting in a spirit of reconciliation when naming these bases. However, it is a blatant slap in the face to the Union soldiers who lost their lives in the battles against these officers. Throughout the course of this video, I will not be going over all of them, but instead a select few. These generals were chosen in part due to their contributions to the Confederacy, as well as their life prior to serving in the CSA military. Although almost all of them were former U.S. military officers, one was not, and he will be the first one that we will be discussing. The first Confederate that I will be discussing will be Henry Louis the Old Rock Benning. Benning was born on a plantation and can be considered a part of the wealthy Southern planter class that existed in the antebellum South. After graduating from Franklin College, which is now known as the University of Georgia, he practiced law and became an active Georgia politician. It should be no surprise that Benning was an ardent secessionist and worked diligently to get Virginia to secede from the Union alongside his native Georgia. One of his main reasons for secession, and I quote, was for fear of the black race gaining power in the South and leaving white men to be vagabonds and white women to suffer a fate that cannot contemplate imagination. Those were his words. For his part, Benning was not a West Point cadet and did not give an oath to protect and serve the Constitution or the people of the United States of America. However, this does not mean that during the war Benning did not command Confederate soldiers. He led his men into battle in the Second Battle of Bull Run, as well as Gettysburg, to name a few of his notable engagements. After the war, he returned home to practice law and died in 1875. The U.S. Army decided to honor Benning by naming a camp after him, which would later go on to become Fort Benning, which is the home of the U.S. Army's Armor School. Instead of naming an installation after a man who had nothing to do with armored vehicles at all, why not name it after someone who did? One of the most influential armor commanders in all of American history, General George S. Patton Jr. Now, if a native Georgian would be preferred, there are 28 servicemen from Georgia who are awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for their service to the United States, and who most importantly did not serve against their country in a war. The second Confederate general that I'll be talking about will be Braxton Bragg. Now, Bragg did not come from the upper echelons of Southern society like some of his peers, but his brother still managed to help him get a letter of recommendation to attend West Point when he was 16. He graduated and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 3rd U.S. Artillery in 1837. After seeing action in the Seminole American War and the Mexican-American War, Bragg retired from the U.S. Army and bought a sugar plantation in 1856. However, when the Civil War began in 1861, Bragg did not rejoin the Union Army or sit out of the war. Instead, he was appointed as a brigadier general of the Confederate States of America. Bragg led troops in numerous battles against the Union, including Shiloh and Chattanooga, to name a few. After the war, Bragg moved around filling many different jobs and died in 1876. The installation that bears his name, Fort Bragg, is the home of the United States military's Special Operations Forces, as well as the Army Airborne School. Instead of naming such a special installation after a man whose military career had nothing to do with airborne operations or special forces soldiers, why not name it after someone who did? Donald Dunwoody Blackburn, a man who was a special forces legend and helped develop the American Special Forces after World War II. Similar to Georgia, if a native son is preferred, there are 30 soldiers from North Carolina whose names deserve the honor that Bragg's name does not. John Bell Hood is another example of the Confederate general who betrayed his country. Hood was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th United States Infantry in 1853. Hood resigned from his command following the Battle of Fort Sumter in 1861 and joined the Confederate Cavalry Corps as a captain. Hood fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War, including the Second Battle of Bull Run and Gettysburg. Something of interest to note is that in a letter Hood wrote to General William Tecumseh Sherman, he accuses Sherman of allying himself with an inferior race with the goal of subjugating the white race. This shows very clearly that for Hood, the Civil War was a war that was being fought over the issue of white supremacy and slavery. After the war, Hood settled in Louisiana and worked in insurance. He later died of yellow fever in 1879. Unlike some of the other Confederate generals that have military installations named after them, Hood was not born in Texas. In fact, his only relationship to Texas was that it was the state he decided to serve in when his home state of Kentucky did not secede from the Union. Instead of honoring a man who came to the state's aid when it was trying to secede from the Union, why not name the installation after one of America's most decorated soldiers, who was a native Texan? Audie Murphy was born and raised in Texas and is one of the most decorated soldiers in World War II, winning almost every single medal available for a soldier to win in the United States Army. The next general we will be discussing is General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, known in his adult life as G.T. Beauregard. He was born in St. Bernard's Parish in Louisiana and grew up on his family's sugarcane plantation. Like many of the other generals mentioned previously, he would go on to attend the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and be commissioned in the United States Army in 1838. Prior to the Civil War, Beauregard would fight in the Mexican-American War and served in numerous engineering roles in his home state of Louisiana prior to 1860. In 1861, he was appointed as the superintendent of West Point. However, he shortly resigned his position when his home state of Louisiana seceded from the Union. Beauregard played a crucial role in some of the Confederacy's early victories, including leading the attack on Fort Sumter and the First Battle of Bull Run. After the war, and unlike many of his other colleagues, Beauregard was a supporter of black civil rights and suffrage, believing that it would be better for Southern Democrats to ally with blacks in order to vote out radical Republicans. Although Beauregard did, in fact, desert his country and helped orchestrate the attack that started the Civil War, as well as lead the Confederate Army in the first battle of the Civil War, his stance towards unifying the black and white population of Louisiana after the war should not go unspoken. However, instead of naming a National Guard base after him, it would be much better if a Medal of Honor recipient from the Louisiana National Guard was chosen. The final Confederate general with a base named after him that we will go over is General Robert E. Lee. Lee is a rather interesting figure, due in part to his role as the South's most successful general in the early stages of the war, as well as the lost cause revisionism that has transformed him into a myth rather than the simple man that he really was. Lee was born into an old and well-established Virginian family in 1807. He eventually went on to the West Point, where he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers in 1829. Lee then went on to have a long and distinguished career in the U.S. military, including service during the Mexican-American War, tenure as a superintendent of West Point, and putting down John Brown's raid of the Federal Arsenal at Harper's Ferry. At the beginning of the secession crisis, Lee remained loyal to the Union and privately believed that a war between the North and South would only be devastating and not be any of the glorious adventures that many of his Southern colleagues believed it would be. However, when his home state of Virginia seceded, Lee, rather than staying loyal and taking a higher rank in the Union Army, opted to resign his command and join the Confederate Army. Lee is most famously known for leading the Army of Northern Virginia after 1862. While leading the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee proved himself a capable tactician and destroyed or routed Union armies at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Fredericksville, and Chancellorsville. However, these victories came to an end after the Battle of Gettysburg, the single bloodiest battle in all of American military history. Although Lee wished to melt into obscurity after his surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865, the legacy that he had sown during the American Civil War made that impossible. He would later die in 1870. Lee was strongly opposed to the idea of Confederate monuments, so honoring him with a U.S. military base seems counterproductive to his own wishes. There are 74 soldiers from Virginia who have earned the Congressional Medal of Honor who will be much better fit to have this base named after them other than Lee. Now, before concluding this video, it is important to mention that renaming bases does not equal erasing history. These men will continue to live on in the history books written by Civil War scholars. Simply taking their names off of U.S. military installations will also not doom the United States to repeat the mistakes of the Civil War. There is a reason there are no military bases named after Benedict Arnold. Traitors do not deserve the honor nor dignity of having military installations named after them. And to do so acts as a slap in the face to the Unions, to the hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers who suffered in order to keep our Union together. And with that, that concludes the first ever Talk with Men. Please leave any questions or comments down below. And if this video has piqued your interest, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends and family. Thank you all for watching my first ever video, and hopefully I hope to see some of you again soon. Thank you and have a good one.